and we are so grateful to have everyone here. This time zone, whatever that time zone may be for you. Happy morning, afternoon, evening, just getting started, working your way through. Again, I am Morgan Gresham. I'm at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and I am joined by Theresa Conefrey, Santa Clara University, and several members of our task force are here doing various participation modes with us, and Kristina is very gratefully doing our slides for us. So we are here to talk a little bit about evaluation of e-portfolios, and I have all of my technology laid out, so I am sorry if I am not looking at you across the time zone, but reaching over to get to our next slide and then get us started with an answer garden. If you haven't tried answer garden before, it's going to, if you'll follow the link that is either in the chat or on the screen, it is going to ask you what is your perception of ethical evaluation of e-portfolios, and then you have about 20 characters to respond back to that. So we'll just take a couple of minutes for you to answer the answer garden question, and then we will get started really in thinking about how we can ethically evaluate e-portfolios. If there is a problem with the link, somebody send up a signal or ask your question, and we'll try to make sure that that is getting to be functional.
Yeah, it seems to be working, Morgan.
Excellent. That is very good news. I'm starting to see some of the answers. Some of the responses that we are getting: student-led, developmental, equitable, formative, social, fair, transparent. If you want to send in a few more responses. Varied feedback, activity appropriate, transparent and clear.
Transparent and clear seems to be a popular choice.
Yes, it does.
Student-led, way up there.
We'll give folks another minute or so if you want to add in an additional answer. Clear expectations, student-centered, accessible. Last call for any additional thoughts.
Oh, I think student-led is emerging as the winner here.
I think so too. It is getting very large. As we are talking, I hope to be able to get a picture of our answer garden so that you can see it in the final version of the slides. But I wanted to get us moving into our conversation, because conversation is why we are all here. We do want to make sure that we are in a space where we feel comfortable and able to challenge each other's ideas and get some really good conversation going. We want to be able to learn from each other. We want to be open to our feedback. We want to be able to keep confidential anything that people share in breakout rooms, but feeling that we are here to learn from each other. And one of the notes that we do want to remind everyone, if you prefer, when we're in the breakout rooms, or now you can change your Zoom handle at any time if you would like to remain anonymous for the recorded portion. We've already all introduced ourselves here in our little space, but for the recording, you would be able to do that going forward. So if we can go on to our next slide, just a quick overview of what we are going to do. We will talk briefly about the principles overall. we're going to talk more specifically about evaluation. We have some examples that we are going to pull from the scenarios. We're going to do an activity. We're going to look at some rubrics, or at least one rubric more closely. And then if we would like to see other rubrics, we can talk about those. We'll have an opportunity to do some breakout rooms depending on the size of our group. So if we have a large number join us here in a few minutes, we may do breakout rooms. It looks like we have about 11 folks on the call, so it may be better to stay all together in one space. As we get closer to that, we'll do some reflection and we will do some summary. So then if we can go to the next slide. We have a folder for you that you can access all of the materials now and going forward. So that is available to you. And then if we can go on to the next slide. What is the AAEEBL Digital Ethics Task Force? We have been working together for 3 years now as a group, an international group of folks. If we can go on to the next slide that shows all of our faces. We have 3 co-chairs right now, and Megan, and one of our Megans is here with us today, and Sarah, who have been leading the effort for the last year to help us work through the process of building out the digital ethics principles. And then as we are moving forward into this process, we are starting to do some additional research. So if we can go on to our next slide, we have identified a need in the ePortfolio community, helping to work through some of the research that needs to be done. Digital ethics is a topic that is rapidly changing with new technologies, laws, and digital practices, and we all recognize how the laws are not able to keep up necessarily with the practices. And so one of the things that we are trying to do is complete that space to be able to talk through some of the ways that even if the things that we are trying to do are brand new and we want to be on the cutting or the bleeding edge of technology, we can do so in an ethical and humane way. And it's an opportunity for international organizations like AAEEBL to advocate for ethically sound e-portfolio practices. If we can go on to the next slide. What we have there is our visual representation of the principles. And as you can see, we are going to focus in on evaluation today, but all of these principles touch upon one another. And one of the things that we see is that there is a lot of crossover. And so as we are thinking through evaluation today, there are going to be other aspects that come up for us. And so we want to be able to touch on those principles as well as we move forward. If we can go on to the next slide. Each principle has, and we will give it a moment to come in. We have a statement overview of what that principle is, and we provide some definitions along with that. And then we have strategies for application. And following the strategies, we have some scenarios, and we're going to look more closely at the scenarios for evaluation today as part of what we are working on. And then we have resources for further reading. And one of the things that I think is really important to note here is those resources for further reading are always being updated. So as we are working through our conversation today, if you have a resource, if you think of a resource in the process of our conversation, if you would please type that into the chat and we will get those added in to our resources, because we think that this is a living document and we really do want to have a part of this continue on. And again, there are lots of resources out there that we are not yet aware of. And so we would like to be able to incorporate those. So today we're going to focus on evaluation. And at this point, I am going to hand it off to Theresa.
Okay, so we were wondering, what are your questions? We have just one slide, if we can move to the next one, that shows you an overview of the evaluation principle. I know there's a lot of text there, but we wanted to give you a moment to ask us any questions. And if we can move to the next slide in a second or two, there's a space. If you click on that link, you can write your questions, and we will be monitoring your questions throughout the presentation to make sure that we address some of them. And just so you know, the slide I showed you, the one about the evaluation principle, we are going to be going back. We're going to be looking at that in a lot of detail, but we wanted to get your questions as soon as possible to make sure that we cover them. All right, let's move on to our summary of evaluating ePortfolios principle. And this text, this language is taken from our principles. We've got the link there as well, or you could find it in the link to the URL of the drive that we shared earlier. But this is the text that we have. ePortfolio evaluation should consider process, inclusion, reflective practice, and alignment with the stated objectives of the context in which the ePortfolio was created. So in a nutshell, those are the main ideas behind our principle. And now I want to break them down into more detail. If we can move to the next slide. Some strategies then for applying this principle. We believe that evaluation measures and procedures that would follow this principle would be fair, transparent, as many of you all mentioned in the cloud or the word garden earlier, that they're inclusive and that they have been explicitly communicated prior to the assignment. So by that we mean that the students have all seen our evaluation rubrics, they know what the procedures are, how they're going to be assessed. All of that is very clear before any assessment takes place. We also believe that the assessment should be aligned with the learning outcomes and informed by research and diverse input. And by this, we're talking about backward design, which I know many people are very familiar with. And I'm sure that you, for your syllabi, you have learning objectives, learning goals, and we'll look at some specific examples of that. So we want the evaluation, the assessment to be aligned to whatever our stated learning outcomes are. And by diverse perspectives, we're thinking too, and that was something that I guess you're all thinking, but the student-led, that students have some input as well. So often schools, administration, there are some assigned goals, assigned learning outcomes, but we feel that often there's still space to have input from students and other stakeholders, and we would like to include those goals too in our assessment and evaluation. Thirdly, it is really helpful if the assessment, the evaluation can be aligned with professional standards that are meaningful beyond the course. So for example, I teach engineering students. We have ABET guidelines, or there could be students who are applying for employment and they might want to use their ePortfolio to share with employers. And in that sense, the ePortfolio that they create, it would have multiple uses. We would be using it for evaluation and assessment, but they would also have something that they could share with others. And so that's what we mean. If at all possible, we want the ePortfolio to be connected to authentic assignments, authentic tasks, authentic ways that a personalized website could be used. And then let's talk about some of the strategies continuing. We believe in both summative and formative approaches to evaluation, and by summative, going beyond just grades and rubrics. And this might include some labor-based criteria, showing up, participating, turning in rough drafts, revising rough drafts, doing peer edits. So all of those kind of processes we would include. And then for formative, by that we mean some ongoing feedback. So rather than introduce the ePortfolio assignment in week 1, and then at the end of the quarter, the semester, ask it to be submitted, we want students to get ongoing feedback, and that feedback could be from us, it could be from instructional technology, it could be peer review, but just so students are getting feedback all along, all throughout the process, and not just required to put everything together at the end. We also believe that it's a good idea to have resources and models available to help faculty and instructors that are designing the assessment and the evaluation. And we want part of that training to be covering biases, different forms of biases, and some of those were a topic of our earlier workshop, where we had what we call the DEIBD principle: diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and decolonization. So if you wanted to look more into that, but we do want to bring up the topic of bias in all its different manifestations. And then finally, something else that we're very interested in this task force, particularly this year, is compensation and recognition for performing evaluations ethically. So we know that this is a new area, and digital ethics and ethical evaluation can be something that's taken for granted. So we would like to have some due recognition compensation for that. All right, and let's move on. Morgan is going to tell us a little bit about what happens when some of these strategies aren't being used to inform our evaluation and assessment.
She can unmute successfully, which she did. Excellent. So one of the things that we wanted to sort of think through is, why is this important? And it's important because unexamined feedback practices do have repercussions. And so we wanted to identify what some of those repercussions might be. We want to make sure that if we are not aware necessarily of some of the power dynamics, that we might be reinforcing existing power dynamics, which create difficulties for both faculty and students and other stakeholders. So we want to make sure that we are not reinforcing those, and we want to look carefully at ways that we can talk through the power dynamics within the use of e-portfolios, and evaluating e-portfolios is one of those spaces where the power dynamic, especially for students, becomes very clear. So it is an opportunity for us who are using e-portfolios to think through what are some of the really important aspects, and then to be able to ask our students to participate in those conversations. Another issue might come up is projecting bias and cultural expectations. And one of the important ways that we see that coming through in e-portfolios is perhaps an insistence on a particular type of professional and or standardized usage of language usage, like standard American English, for example, standard edited English as an example, that we might want to talk through with our e-portfolio makers and try to get a sense of where students, for example, see that coming through in the e-portfolios that they are being asked to complete. Another unexamined practice might be enforcing homogeny or conformity in e-portfolios in ways that we haven't necessarily thought of. One of the examples that I have seen recently is thinking through e-portfolios across an institution where everyone is expected to produce a particular kind of e-portfolio. And within that conformity, you lose a lot of variedness of student voices, as well as the kinds of things that students might use to identify themselves. So we want to make sure that as we are working through these evaluation practices, that we are working with our students to talk through some of those pieces of identity, some of those pieces of what it means to be in a student led space, to be in a professional workspace, to how these different aspects of an e-portfolio might be coming forward, and then privileging institutional needs versus student learning. And I think that this is one of the things that we bump up against quite frequently in institutionalized e-portfolios. So if a student wants to do something more video-based or more image-based, and the expectations of those portfolios are more textual-based, then we might be privileging those institutional needs. So one of the places that we might talk through is how we have experienced those e-portfolios, the systems that we are seeing in place, and then starting to get a sense of, from that base, where we might go forward with this conversation. So at this point, if we could have a little bit of conversation, what are some of the things that you have been noticing about e-portfolios at your particular context, and how can we start to address some of those questions that we might be having? So there are two ways that we can have this conversation. We can talk through in the chat, or if you are willing to unmute yourself and give us a little bit of the context of your space, that would be very helpful for us as we move forward. Is anybody willing to talk a little bit about the ways that they have seen or thought about ethical evaluation strategies?
So I'm happy to jump in. So Morgan, Theresa, so this is one of the questions I put into the document. I mean, just this differentiation between evaluation versus assessment. And I was wondering if you might be able to speak a little bit more about that, because I think, in terms of how we're assessing student work and creating a rubric, align with our learning outcomes for our course or for the assignment, versus evaluation, which when I think about it, like for, do I need an IRB or not? Is it evaluation or is it research? I guess it's sort of the mentality or approach I'm coming to this, but I wonder if you might be able to kind of, provide a better, some additional kind of background or insights into your orientation to thinking about evaluation versus assessment.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a really important question. And it was one of those slides that I thought, should we put in, should we not put in? So when the task force was really starting to draft around evaluation, we actually started with the term assessment. And so we were going to build out from assessment and then identify all of these aspects that you were just noting. And one of the things we realized going into that is, oh my goodness, this is huge. Assessment is huge. And we were seeing evaluation underneath that assessment umbrella. So we started looking at program assessment, institutional assessment, classroom assessment, and that's where we ultimately landed, is a version of classroom assessment, which we termed evaluation. And so our principle around evaluation really is sort of looking at how those portfolios that students create, particularly embedded in classes or in a class situation, and not necessarily the professional e-portfolios that students might create, or not necessarily that four-year institutional assessment kind of program that we were looking at. And so when we were thinking about evaluation, what is it that the stakeholders are bringing to that conversation, particularly in terms of that more classroom-based situation? Theresa, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so we shared with you the link to the principles, and that is something that we have talked a little bit about. When we go into our quiet reading in a few minutes to look at the scenarios, we have a little breakout there on how we're using the terms evaluation and assessment, because we do know that there are lots of different ways of using those terms. And from our documents, we say that evaluation and assessment, it depends on the intended use of the feedback.
Mm.
And we're using evaluation in the sense of it being typically focused on the outcome, whereas assessment might be a little bit more the process.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So how, but I've seen it different ways, but in the way that we've described it, then there could be different forms of assessment going into the evaluation. And whereas mentioning earlier that we were trying to be a little bit more inclusive than just one form of assessment, we might evaluate, to use the other word there, labor as well, or rough drafts and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thanks so much. I mean, just to kind of put some parameters on it, because, you know, and of course, those terms come with their own baggage as well. So,
right.
So this is really helpful in terms of thinking about the classroom context. I don't want to take up all the time, but, you know, Theresa, you mentioned, you know, backwards design. I mean, to what extent is what you're proposing just good instructional design? I mean, that, you know, that we have have clear outcomes laid out. You know, we have a rubric that's aligned with the outcomes. The rubric is shared with the students, you know, and, you know, everyone is, you know, on board, on the same page as to what to expect, what they will, you know, what to produce, as well as what they will receive.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We would hope that if you follow our principles, that it would lead to effective practices, that you would have an effective syllabus, you would be performing valid, credible,
Mm-hmm.
effective, authentic assessment. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the pieces that we wanted to bring forward in this is that there are multiple paths to this conversation. And so for some people, hearing those terms, backward design, becomes something that is too great for them to try to deal with. And so having an opportunity to say, well, I'm really concerned about my students. I really want to value what is coming from my students, might offer them a path into that conversation that the backwards design piece does not. And so I don't think that necessarily we've come to some brand new idea, but that we are providing some pathways into a place where we can have those conversations about what does it mean to be an ethical consumer or an ethical producer of e-portfolios. So again, I think that speaks to those sort of big picture ideas. We're talking about labor, we're talking about practice, we're talking about evaluation, we're talking about assessment. All of those are really large concepts. And so we're just trying to be able to get to a place where we can have some of those conversations in multiple spaces, so that we are inviting everyone into that conversation and hearing from some of the folks we may not have heard from before with respect to what does it mean to be an ethical producer if you're a student, what does it mean to be an ethical consumer if you are a student, and many other opportunities there, but those are the ones that sort of come to the fore for me. How do I help my students sort of think through these conversations?
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much.
Maybe we could use the time now to look at our principles in depth.
Yes. So what we would like to do then is bring up scenario 1 and scenario 2 from the principles and have an opportunity for you to spend a little bit of quiet time actually reading the evaluation principle. I'm pretty sure I saw it go by in the chat a couple of times, but if we can toss it back in there again, and then we'll just take a few minutes with that link. I'm assuming that everybody is able to have the link open and take a look at the evaluation principle. And then we were going to look more specifically at scenario 1 and scenario 2. So what I'd like to do is offer this quiet reading time with the principal and looking specifically at scenario 1, scenario 2. And then after about 8 minutes, we will come back and start a little more conversation there. And I'm going to set a timer on my other screen just so that I can keep track of where we are. So 8 minutes goes by fairly quickly when you're looking at a fair amount of text. I hope that you had a chance to look at both scenario 1 and scenario 2. And what I'd like to do is just to open out for a little bit of discussion. In just a minute, we will look more specifically at a first-year composition, e-portfolio assignment, and a rubric. But before we do that, what were some of the responses that you had to scenario 1 and scenario 2, especially with respect to how you see those ethical issues in those scenarios? And what do you think is being of use in the 2 scenarios that we've created, and what's missing from those scenarios? So if you have some feedback, some ideas, this would be a great time for us to sort of talk through some of that.
So I'll start with some of my thoughts in response to scenario 1, just to kind of get the ball rolling. I thought overall it showed an ethical response to the situation, although I did see a couple things lacking, but I liked that the administrator stopped and paused and took into considerations different contexts, different needs, and thinking about disciplinary diversity, and that student voice was also an important part of the equation. So, and I also thought it was a wise move to provide a framework of broader guidelines and expectations for people to kind of do their context-specific work within. So I thought that all sounded great. One of the things, though, that I paused about is that, or maybe I'm misreading it, but it mentions, these 5 general areas that are very literacy specific, which sounds great as a set of things for people to consider, but that's not necessarily the whole picture, right? And it's not necessarily all about literacy at the end of the day. Those could be important elements that people might want to develop their portfolios to focus on, but there are other goals, other outcomes people might have in mind. Reflection and metacognition might be really important. There are all kinds of other things that within each specific program, or I guess I should say, I'm trying to think of the subgroup terminology, department or discipline or what have you, that they might be compelled to do those portfolios for. And they shouldn't be limited by just those 5. There should be room for them to also add, rather than simply just defining how they're going to respond to those 5 different ones. So that's my initial reaction to it. I'll stop there.
I think those are really interesting points.
Yeah, and we're going to look at a specific example, and you'll be able to see are some of your concerns, are they addressed in the specific example? How would the scenarios relate to a particular assignment in a particular class?
I agree with that completely. And I think that one of the things that we may not have talked through necessarily as a task force is we have a particular sort of writing studies bent. So literacy is one of those things that, oh yeah, that would be a primary focus. But I think that you're right in terms of what are some of the other things that we might want the e-portfolios to privilege. Have we talked through, are we even aware that we have this sort of literacy bent here, and how do we make sure that the principals are open enough to really be ethically focused, digitally ethically focused, and not necessarily a particular disciplinary focus. So I think that that's a really good point. Other folks, what are some of the things that stood out to you from scenario 1, scenario 2, the combination, or what Laura was just recognizing for us?
One thing I think that these scenarios are really helpful in reminding me is disrupting assumptions that we have just by simply inviting others to speak to them. It can be colleagues across disciplines or the students themselves. I was talking in the chat earlier when you asked about strategies, and I was asked to teach a capstone cybersecurity course, and I'm projecting onto them English scholarship And then I'm looking at what their program assumes about what they are and why they're doing this program. They think they're all 19-year-olds who've never been in industry. And what was really happening in my class is a lot of folks who are coming from like NASA and DC, who are well-versed in the field. They don't need the same kind of portfolio. And so stopping and stepping back and saying, okay, what is it you want to see here? What is benchmarks of success for you? Let's draft that together, and then also weave in the other expectations. Really, just in short, the scenarios really remind me to pause and figure out what voices need to be at the table to help me better evaluate what it is we're actually striving for versus something that was created by a committee 10 years ago who don't know these people in the classroom. They've never met these folks, and they certainly haven't gone through a pandemic when they wrote these criteria, you know.
So very true, I think. And I think that that's really sort of one of those hard pieces around focusing in on evaluation, is recognizing in many ways it does get limited to particular instantiations of the principles, or thinking about it in terms of a specific course or a specific program. And I think that that was one of the places where that larger umbrella around assessment might open up some of those voices again. And always important to be thinking about, as an individual, how am I interacting with these conversations? And then what are the pieces that I need? Who are the stakeholders that I need to be bringing into these conversations, especially as more and more institutions are looking at incorporating e-portfolios, or, you know, looking back at what they have been doing in terms of assessment or evaluation and starting to make some different choices. So I think that that is really important for us to try to continue to bring new people into those conversations. Other thoughts about how these might be useful, how we might want to work to improve them in the future as the task force continues to grow and develop these, or what are some of the things that just sort of, were there any sort of aha moments for anyone in terms of looking at scenario 1 or scenario 2 before we move into the more specific first year composition assignment 1? Laura.
Yeah, I can share an aha moment that I made note of that I want to start doing is that class shared question, whether it's a document or a space in our LMS or something like that. I really liked that idea. One of the questions I have, though, because in response to scenario 2, which I thought was really interesting, and I liked the reminder that we shouldn't use jargon that might distance our students from what it is that we're actually trying to do, and all those different sorts of things, and explain why we're doing it and bring them in on the process with peer review, which I use a lot of in my courses, especially my portfolio course. Is one of the things that I'm wrestling with has to do with both timing and expertise, right? So it mentioned that there were 2 blank spaces in the rubric for students to self-generate their own criteria for the rubric, which I think is a lovely idea. But that might be something that I would typically have a conversation with the students maybe toward the end when we're doing a wrap-up roundtable conversation where we look back on it once they have a sense of the whole and how all the pieces fit together. But to try to do that in real time while they're also trying to craft their portfolio, provide meaningful feedback to one another, think about what's happening next or the next element of the portfolio and that sort of thing, to then also ask them to think about then the criteria at the moment at which they're still doing all that creation. I'm just curious as to how that works out and how that plays out, because in principle, I support it. But practically speaking, I'm also trying to give them a reasonable load for what they're doing. And I'm just curious how that works while they're also trying to take care of everything else that they're being asked to do in their portfolio course.
So I can speak to sort of my own experiences with that, and then sort of lay out that my experiences have been very varied in terms of my ability to do this, my students' ability to do this, and recognize that there are at least two other pieces of the principles that you get sort of targeted there. One is making sure that students have practice with these ideas, and then the other one is the visibility of labor. And while we've been thinking a lot about faculty labor, we should also be thinking a lot about student labor. And so for me, in my own writing classes and in my e-portfolio class, and one of my e-portfolio classes was a capstone class, we were integrating both practice and evaluation throughout the course of the semester. And, you know, sort of your mileage may vary kind of thing. I have had some groups of students who have been able to pick up that ball and say, we really want to be able to craft our evaluation criteria here at the beginning of this course. And I think that it was probably most successful with a group of students who had taken, I teach a lot of writing courses, and I used to teach a course called Intro to the English Major, and then I did a senior portfolio class. And so the students who took the Intro to the Major course with me developed a portfolio, then they took a bunch of courses, and then they came back to me in the senior portfolio class. So they got a lot of practice, they got a lot of evaluation in little bitty steps in the interim, and they were very successful. And so at that senior portfolio class, the first couple of days, we're able to say, hey, we're going to create a portfolio. It's going to be your capstone portfolio. You're going to have a project in it. What are the evaluation criteria that you want to have? And they just came up with all sorts of amazing criteria, visual criteria, expectations around language, expectations around how the different pieces might work together. So some of that metacognition and some of that reflection, all of those pieces came in together. However, I've also done this with first year students, and it's a much more labor intensive process for them and for me, because we're just learning what that means, I think. And so it is laying, for me, my own practice, it is laying out very early and then hoping I'm having the opportunity to meet with students again and again over the course of their time at the institution to be able to practice, to be able to evaluate, and to be able to talk very candidly about the labor process, both on their side and on my side. But again, it is one of those things where sometimes it works really well, and then sometimes it's like, why did I choose to do this to myself, or why did I make this mistake for my students? And so always trying to learn from that process. Other folks, or Laura, do you have questions or feedback in terms of the response that I had?
That was really helpful. So thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. It gives me some good food for thought to think that through.
And again, it's always, for me, it's always a learning process. Every time I do this, I start with what I have been doing and realize I have to make changes. And that's actually the fun part for me, is how is this going to grow and evolve? But I recognize that that really does increase my labor, but I feel like that labor really is able to produce something. And so I'm willing to invest that labor into the time and the energy that I have available to give to the students at that point. Other folks, scenario 1 or scenario 2, or we can move into the more specific example that Theresa has for us with regard to first year composition.
Okay, so this is a composition, or this is an assignment for e-portfolios in first year composition. And for those of us who are listening in from other countries, first year composition, it's something that all students are required to take at public and private colleges in the US. And the idea is to get all students up to college writing standards. Some institutions let students qualify, opt out of it, depending on the experience they've had before. Some have honor sections, but in general, it's kind of a rite of passage for first year students in the States. So I've got an example here from first year composition at my institution, Santa Clara University. And this relates to scenario 1 insofar as all students have to take it and a variety of different faculty teach it. Predominantly faculty in the English department, but they could be in theater, they could be literature, writing studies, they could be creative writing, also faculty in Spanish, philosophy, music, ethnic studies, histories. And whoever's teaching it has the same general learning objectives, learning outcomes, but the topic varies depending on the interest of the instructor. So it could be about leisure, it could be about food, it could be, what other fun topics have we had? It could be about ghosts and zombies. So really the topic can vary greatly. And everyone can also decide how many assignments or how they're going to assess their students. And many, but not all faculty have some kind of ePortfolio assignment. The example here then is an ePortfolio assignment that would have been introduced at the beginning of the quarter, that would have been part of a syllabus. And then students are coming towards the end of the quarter, looking at the description of the ePortfolio assignment and planning to turn it in a few weeks from then. So these are the instructions that they were given to review the learning goals and objectives of the course, and then provide evidence that they have met those learning goals and objectives. So they do that in 2 ways. They submit a reflection essay, which brings everything together. And in that essay, they could be responding to some of the questions you can see listed. And they're also required to submit evidence from their essays to support whatever they say. And students could choose to upload whole essays, or they could take paragraphs. And again, this is it's a reflection essay as part of an ePortfolio that would also contain other information. It could contain information about the course. There could be blogs. There could be, what else? Responses to each other. Then can we move to the next slide? The next slide shows the essay rubric that the students would receive. So let's imagine that the essay assignment and the rubric are a part of the LMS. My institution has Canvas, though I know that there are other Blackboard and other LMSs out there. So students see this information. They would have this information at the beginning of the quarter. And then as they are preparing to submit their ePortfolio, they could go back again and they'll see this rubric outlined before them. And you can see this one is a version that has 3 different categories: content mechanics, digital literacy, which may or may not relate to the different categories, the different kind of literacy that we saw in scenario 1, and may or may not address some of the concerns of students in scenario 2. So we wanted to give you time, about 15 minutes, for a small group discussion to think through again those scenarios that we discussed, and through the lens of this one particular assignment with a rubric, how does it or does it not address some of the concerns that you saw in the scenarios?
Okay, so Morgan seems to be having some audio issues at the moment.
Okay.
Theresa, well, if you could kind of take us over, please.
Yeah. Okay, so let's continue. I put in the chat the general question: how could we bring this ePortfolio assessment and rubric into better alignment with our evaluation principle. If we consider the two of them as a combo, the assignment description and the rubric, what were your thoughts? Laura.
Hi. So I think it goes in response to your question concerning looking at the strategies associated with the principle around the evaluation criteria. What struck me is that the rubric, the first criterion, I think it was in the content label one, actually seemed to be 3 different things packed into one. So it needed to be teased apart because the rubric shouldn't, each one single thing shouldn't have too many different compound elements. So for instance, the prompt is actually asking students to show 3 different sets of skills. It's asking them to talk about the specific learning goals or outcomes with the course. It's asking them to reflect on their process and their learning. And it's also asking them to make effective use of evidence to explain or justify. And so if the point of the rubric is to help the students understand what they're supposed to do, as well as to help the person evaluating it understand what to look for, if you look at the prompt and you look at the rubric, there's a lot missing between the two. And those 3 elements actually need to be teased out into separate criteria so that then both the students can understand the importance of each of those 3 layers of the assignment as well as the evaluator. So that goes back to that transparency piece, I guess, and also aligning better with best practices in which you shouldn't have a compound element within a single criterion in a rubric anyway. And also you should make the learning visible, you know, what it is that we're looking for more visible. And so that was my first thought, having to do with the rubric itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's really interesting. Yeah, and as it is pretty obvious that in that rubric, there's a lot packed into those 3 sections. Do you have any thoughts, or anyone else have a thoughts? What would be a practical way to do that? Because at some point there's a tension between the length and the complexity of the rubric and the transparency. Is it even, how is it even possible to capture everything in a rubric, I wonder?
I don't think we should ever capture everything in a rubric, but I think it should at least match the assignment description at a minimum. And if the assignment description is saying we're looking for those 3 things, then the rubric needs to put those 3 things clearly teased apart.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe just a quick question to clarify, Theresa. So the assignment is to write this essay that really, you know, for the students to kind of talk about their growth over time, how they've changed, you know, over during the course and so on. And the rubric is looking at the essay that they've produced, where they're discussing this growth. Is that right?
Well, actually, the rubric, now that I'm looking at it, this is a sort of modified, simplified version for today of rubric of assignments and rubrics I've seen over years. The rubric, I believe, it would actually be for the whole assignment, not just the reflection essay.
Okay.
So, so the issues, part of it where it refers to digital literacy, links and functions, logical layout, and navigation would be referring to the ePortfolio as a whole. But I'm wondering, you know, thinking aloud and back to what Laura had said, maybe there might need to be multiple rubrics, because I'm thinking of rubrics I've seen that have been so complicated with, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 rows, that sometimes students haven't appreciated that either. They have kind of turned off before investigating it in detail, or even for the person grading it. It can become, depending on the number of assignments, number of ePortfolios to be graded, it can become too much.
So is it at a more holistic level then? I guess when I think about, for example, we look at the value rubrics from AAC&U, and it's at an institutional level. And then but if you want to use it pragmatically, and maybe this really speaks to the conversation we had earlier about operationalization, how do you operationalize it, take that institutional level rubric, then now align it with your outcomes at a department or program, or school level, then department or program level, then class level, and then down to the assignment that's producing the artifact that you're going to hold them and say, this is a demonstration of, written competency and written communication. And so I'm curious as to, and again, even with the scenario one, on one hand, and maybe this is where I would turn to Megan, as an ePortfolio coordinator, you can't possibly predict what all the different departments and programs are using ePortfolios. How do they define professionalism or, digital ethics or whatever it might be? But is it that your role as a ePortfolio coordinator, who has this big picture, you at least provide them a framework to kind of say, here are the things that you need to keep in mind, but you're going to operationalize it and personalize it to a way that makes sense for your discipline.
That was a question for Morgan. I'm just wondering if Morgan's got her sound back.
Yeah, Morgan or Megan.
Or Megan.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I actually wanted to also kind of add on to that. One of the things I noticed in this rubric, and I see it in a lot of rubrics across disciplines, are things like appropriate and sophisticated. And sometimes those are problematic terms for me because I find that they're used to exclude students who don't use language that people appreciate, or especially in portfolios, don't represent themselves in ways that are professional. So we see embedded in this rubric some really subjective, murky language that could allow for bias and feedback, or enforce conformity, or pushing students towards certain performances. So I really struggle with the word sophisticated, even as an English scholar, recognizing what I think that means, or appropriate, that really needs contextualization. And again, goes back to what's the purpose for the student and what's the purpose for me, and how can we try to make those more aligned so that we agree on what we mean when I say appropriate or sophisticated, and thus I'm not bouncing them out because they're not aligned to my idea of identity performance.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why I thought it related well to scenario 2 from the student's perspective. So as you said, some of those words are subjective, but even some of it to me reflects academic speak as well. I'm wondering about the visual rhetoric, how much that had been unpacked in the classroom, and what the student would understand by that. But yes, this does get us all into the DEIBD considerations that we mentioned earlier. But also to Helen's question, and I guess to Laura's as well, I'm still wondering how we could do this in one rubric, and would we have to have multiple rubrics depending on the purpose? One rubric for the students, and then another rubric for the program assessors.
Okay, again, I think I get what you're, yeah, because actually, interestingly, so I teach at the graduate level, but we've put this together in a somewhat similar way, in which we have a signature assignment that's going to be assessed at the core level and then at the capstone level. And we did ultimately come up with a 2-rubric system, one that is more written with the student and the specific instructor in mind for grading it for the purposes of the class, right? Did you do the thing that we've asked you to do in the way, right? And so that rubric exists, and we hope is explanatory and clear and that sort of thing. And then we have another layer of a rubric for program assessment purposes. And that is more internal for us to see progression and growth across the timeline. So kind of similar to a first-year student versus, a graduating student in undergrad, same thing in grad school, first coming in versus leaving, where they're supposed to be able to show mastery. And that's more the behind the scenes. And we've actually been debating, do we show students that other program assessment rubric because of the principles of transparency and all those different sorts of things? Or is that a back of the house kind of because it has more of the assessment language to it? The two rubrics aren't at odds with each other, but it has to do with kind of the level of detail that they go into and those different kinds of things. But so I don't have the answer clearly to that, Theresa, but at least that idea that we did see a need to tease apart what is used in the class for grading purposes, and then what we're looking at for program assessment purposes, which is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. And then taking that to another level too, again, thinking about scenario 2, where would the space be for student input? If we were to say that we were being transparent and we were encouraging students to help co-contribute or add suggestions to the rubric, where would that fit in?
I wonder, going back to my earlier comment about how criteria are often context specific and the academy is changing so rapidly, as are our students, like, could that program not try to make it something that happens every 1 to 2 years, where there is a forum where students see that rubric and learn how the program is evaluating them and speak back to it and talk about their experiences as they've tried to build this portfolio. So then that becomes a living document that can adapt to the time. So then going to Laura's earlier question about faculty labor, this kind of happens outside class time and maybe gives them some sort of roadmap to be like, okay, I heard the student forum. I need to think about this when I am designing evaluation in my class.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Because also going back to earlier part of the discussion about how much we can expect from our students at the time, and particularly if we're saying that this is freshmen, these are or first year students, how much can we expect them to be metacognitive about what we're doing in the process of actually doing it?
I'm trying out a new mic. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes,
Yay.
we are.
Excellent. So I wanted to jump in on that and say, I do think that we end up having to create multiple sets of rubrics according to institutional context. So something that happens in the classroom may not be applicable outside of the classroom, but that we can bring those program rubrics that our departments create or our institutional effective offices create and talk through those with our students. I don't necessarily think that they're going to know everything at the beginning of that practice, but if we have the opportunity to have those conversations multiple times, and again, you have to have that space to be able to say, we're actually going to focus on looking at how the institution says that it assesses us and what that means to us as individuals, what that means to this particular class. And that sometimes means giving up some other aspect of the class that you're teaching. But for me, that's been one of those trade-offs that I've needed to do, to be able to say, what does it mean when we say these words like appropriate language? What does that mean as a group of people in this classroom? What are we assuming that other faculty who have created this rubric that is then going to be used to look at your portfolios that don't have any access to you as a group of students? What does that mean for them, for you? How do we talk through those terms? And I agree that the academy is absolutely changing, not as quickly as we would like it to sometimes. And so having that opportunity to invite students into that conversation and letting them see the opportunities that having their voice shared grants them, they will help us change it faster. And I think for me, that's a really important aspect. It's not going to move as quick. The institution moves at glacial speed sometime, most of the time, but hoping that this is one of those spaces, evaluation and e-portfolios, with all of the really wonderful things and all of the really dark things that get embedded in both of those pieces, can play out for us to talk through with students, give
us and them different aspects on the language, and then to be able to make those changes. So for me, I see it as a change maker, the evaluation piece as a change maker. And it's hard work, it's slow work, but I do think that it is actually working, and we can start to see the evidence of that in some of the conversations that are happening here and in social media and other spaces.
I'm thinking too that we mentioned formative approaches as well. And so some of this could come under that criteria, that we could be introducing the assignment, the rubrics early on, and using that in terms of a formative approach to the e-portfolio.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One question that might be a bit too obvious, or maybe it's too obvious and nobody's asking it, I don't know. But when we have multiple rubrics, so one that the students see and one that is maybe used for program evaluation or other evaluation, would you then share that rubric that you're using with the students and the instructors as part of that program evaluation in order to have that transparency, and knowing that the students then weren't graded on the program rubric, but on a different one?
I would say sort of a both and approach to that. So recognizing these are the things that are happening in the classroom, and these are the evaluation criteria that as a class we've agreed on, but also recognizing that the program says we have to do these things, and which of the things are we going to say, well, we're going to hope for the best with those evaluation criteria, that looking at that, that our class created evaluation tool didn't get to. Or, you know, sometimes we live in that space where we do have the giant 50-item rubric, and recognizing that it is one of those pieces that we're always being evaluated in many different situations. And so which ones are we going to value? Which ones are the students going to value? Which ones are we as instructors in a program going to value? And how do we help our colleagues who might be valuing something different see why we might have chosen to value things differently? So I see a series of conversations that we might need to have in terms of curriculum and in terms of how various pieces fit together, and how the institution might need to look at things a little differently in order to make sure that our students are being served in the ways that we really want them to be. So again, for me, it is a lot of processes. I feel like I am always recreating evaluation tools with my students, having conversations with my colleagues, hoping and looking at curriculum to see which things are still working, which things are not. All of that is labor intensive. But I think that that's where I want to spend my time and my energy to help my students be successful. But there are many paths to that. And so other folks have had different experiences, and, you know, sometimes you are beholden to a particular kind of rubric or a particular evaluation scenario. And so just trying to talk through, recognize the realities of the things that sometimes you're stuck in, I think is important too.
And I think this touches on our early discussion about the strategies, where we discussed resources and models to support effective evaluation design, training and materials to apply, developing awareness of bias, and then compensation for all this work that we're doing that would need to happen outside and would be relevant and necessary in a case like scenario one, where we are having faculty across the disciplines, maybe multiple departments, taking part in the evaluation, in the departmental evaluation, the program evaluation.
Again.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it just randomly occurred to me, again, we work for other departments in cybersecurity. They just have the most money right now, so they get the most time. But we run a portfolio competition for them that involves faculty and employers from the field, and they always give comments for all the portfolios they look at. And, this year I took and anonymized those comments and shared it with the capstone course so that they could see what employers were directly pointing at or what the faculty at the program level were wishing they saw more of. And I immediately got feedback from my students that was so helpful, because again, they thought they're guessing. Like they know what I will evaluate them on in the course, but they know there's a second or even tertiary audience lurking out there. And so it didn't take that much work for me to grab those comments and pull out. But I saw an immediate change in how they were designing their content, because now they had a very authentic audience to aim at. So, I mean, I know there's a lot of labor out there, but there's also things we can do that can make evaluation a little more impactful for them without forums and 500 rubrics. It's just, if we see that comments or those commentaries happening, make them available to the students. They shouldn't sit with me. I'm not the one learning to make a website. Like they need to hear it. So it was one of the faster, more engaged conversations with an asynchronous course. Like people immediately responded and asked for clarification on what some of the employers had to say. So
I think that's a great idea
too. That gets to our strategy about aligning our evaluation with professional standards that are meaningful beyond the course. Anything that we can do to make our evaluation more authentic is going to be very beneficial.
And it seems to me there's often low-hanging fruit for that. So Megan, you had that available to you and realized that there was the opportunity to share that with students. And I think that that's one of the things that I often find is there are the spaces for the casual conversation, or, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that I was sitting on this pocket of employer feedback. And so being able to turn that around. And I think that that's one of the takeaways that I have for this conversation is looking more specifically at some of those low-hanging fruits and trying to get a sense of sharing that information out. I hadn't thought, do I have access to those employer feedback solutions? No, I don't. Yeah, I do. Okay, I can absolutely incorporate that into my capstone course in a way that I hadn't thought of before. And so what are some of those other strategies that you just suddenly realize, oh, I have access to? Can we share those with one another, especially those of us who are doing this e-portfolio work? Clearly, we have access to lots of things that we can provide to our students or to other stakeholders that would help them be responsive in those contexts.
Well, I'd like to move us on now, because this is a fascinating discussion, but I'm also paying attention to the time. And we wanted to bring it back to your own institutions. So if we can move to the slide on reflection. We wanted to give you a little time now, about 12 minutes, to identify a document that you use at your institution, and then read back over that document, determine to what extent it addresses or raises some of the issues that we've discussed, consider what changes you might want to make, and then reflect on political pathways and challenges to establishing these changes in your context. And we'll be drawing on some of the discussion we've already had. So I'd like to give everybody a little bit of time to do that, and then we'll come back as a group to share your reflections. Or I should say, share your reflections on your reflections. Yes, please, yes.
So we can leave this slide up so that you'll know what you're being asked to do. The goal here is find something and then think through it, and we'll come back and talk about what you thought through. I'm really hoping that this time when we come back that my mic is working. If you could give me a nod, excellent. I am so glad. So what we'd like to do, we have just a couple of minutes left. We would like to hear from you in terms of your reflections. What's one thing that you are currently doing and one thing that you want to do in the future with regard to changing your practice, improving your practice of ePortfolio evaluation, wherever you're starting from, something that you are doing now and something that you would like to do more and better or differently in the future. So feel free to unmute yourself and just share with us.
Okay, I'll rodeo in. I mean, granted, it's not at the course level, but it would impact the course level. In the course of our conversation today, I've been thinking about things that I've done within my courses and as my role as a director for portfolio work. I think I need to more aggressively advocate to my peers across disciplines that they should do things like I mentioned earlier, having periodic forums with students to talk publicly about the portfolios and expectations and clarify what it is that the faculty are being told and how the program is envisioning these materials being built within courses. Like I said in the chat, and I wasn't being facetious, students know there is this shadow audience, but they never get to them. And so this places a lot of work on the individual in the classroom, the faculty member, to be the voice for that, while also advocating for course level concepts. So my takeaway from here is to more fervently stress that at both course and program level, we have those student feedbacks on evaluation and what it is they're striving for themselves. Because I really do think a lot of portfolio assignments I'm seeing are designed with such assumptions about what students want and who our students are, that it's hard for them because they have to kind of pretend to be those things, and thus it totally undermines the value of a portfolio.
I think that sounds like a great goal. Other folks, things that struck you that you are doing or that you want to do, even if it's just a hope for the future kind of thing.
I'll share. So one of the things, so I'm transitioning from a more, how do I want to put it, just submission-based version of Portfolio to a true ePortfolio platform. And I have built into the course a whole section on students looking at the digital ethics principles that you've been showing us today and that sort of thing. And so part of what I came in wanting to think about is, okay, I have some reflection questions in mind for the students in response to the digital ethics principles, but what else should I? And so I think really this idea of student voice and creating more room for them to talk about what does that mean for them? Because my students have different things at stakes than some of the other students and contexts that you've all talked about. So some things that might matter in a different context aren't really as important to them, but there might be other things that really do matter to them. And having them help craft and define what that piece looks like and what it is about these principles that actually is not just me telling them why the principles are important, but what is it about the principles that they're particularly concerned about, or that catches their attention, or that they want to hear more about, rather than me just flagging to say, hey, it's really important that you're aware that, you know, your ePortfolio is done in a way that's ethical and responsible and all those things. But so that's kind of where I am thinking through those pieces.
I hope that you will be willing to share some of those responses with us as you move with your students through that process, because I think that sounds a fabulous way to really invite them into that conversation and to help us all help us learn from what your students are saying. So please do plan to keep in touch on that process.
Yeah, that would be really exciting, because we've all said we want the student perspective, but it's just how to get that student perspective. So that would be really great if you could share that with us, Laura.
Other folks want to reflect in, say how you are planning to do something, or just something that you learned from your own practice by looking back.
I'm happy to weigh in. First of all, thank you so much to Morgan and Theresa and this wonderful team for just organizing this conversation. It's really been tremendous. You know, I have to wonder, and maybe this is going to be sacrilegious to say so, and I know this is being recorded, but like, our rubric's the only way. You know, if we're really trying to build this culture, this conversation, I think I saw a comment from let me see, here in the chat, I think it was from Maureen that talked about having this group discussion as being really important. That, are we really trying to build this culture of portfolio practice or thinking about these ideas? It can't be that the rubric is the only way to go. And so, just want to raise that, that idea, because this is, I think, much more than just what any particular singular rubric could possibly accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Thinking beyond and outside the rubric. I like it.
Right.
Yes. And I agree. I always come back to, why did we start using these rubrics? What are we hoping to get from the rubrics? And then how can we continue that conversation? So if there are ways that we can put into practice more of that conversation and helping students, for my own experience, students see rubrics sometimes as something really scary, but also something that they feel like is a series of check boxes. And so if there are ways that we can shift that conversation or shift that space away from these are the check boxes to this is something that we are all in together, and we're trying to move this process in a particular way that is going to be beneficial for everyone involved, I think that would be really helpful. I'm hoping that as we continue these different workshops, so spoiler alert, there are more workshops coming up over the course of the summer and into the fall. And as we are going to conferences, yes, thank you, Kristina. There are opportunities to continue this conversation. And I feel like there's so much that we have to learn from each other, that if you can sort of agree to come and be part of that conversation with us in the task force and trying to get a sense of how we can continue to shift these practices. And also, a subset of the task force is looking to implement a research project where we're finding out what folks who are responsible in some way for e-portfolios at various institutions. This particular set we're going to run through North America, but then we're hoping to be able to open that out for other folks as well. But just e-portfolios are an invaluable changing topic. And if we can really continue to develop this conversation, I think that we will certainly, and our students most certainly, will reap the benefits of those changing practices. So I'm hoping that we will be able to have you come to some of the other events that we're having. There's a webinar on June 9th on support and practice. Some of us are going to be at the AAEEBL annual meeting in July. And then of course there's the link there for the scholarship, the big research project, basically, that we are trying to grow and develop. And then what is our next slide? I think we are talking about getting in touch with us. So you have our email addresses. There is an opportunity coming to your inbox very soon to give us some feedback on this particular workshop. And I hope that you will be very direct with your feedback so that we can incorporate that. Going to be doing part of this workshop again for a different audience at computers and composition. And then again at ABLE, so we'd love to be able to make sure that we're really meeting the needs of the community and really sort of getting a sense of how we can continue to grow and develop with ePortfolios. Theresa, anything else you wanted to add before we close up here in about 2 minutes?
I wanted to thank everyone for being here with us today and to encourage you to keep going with the conversation. If you can, meet us at the ABLE convention, and it is being offered both online and in person, which should make it easier to attend. So we'd love to see you there, and we'd love to hear from you. No easy answers, but let's keep trying.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all again for coming. And I am so grateful to my colleagues on the task force who have made this yet another wonderful workshop. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you all for participating. If you realize you had a question before we end, you can quickly ask that question or send any of us an email. But thank you again for your participation.